Okay, I will get started as everyone continues to join. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another PNP Live. My name is Bashan. I am part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Before we do get started with our event, I have just a couple quick items. The first is that at any time during the event, if you would like to ask a question of either of our authors today, I would ask for you to place them in the Q&A box, which could be found at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, just to help us kind of keep everything organized. Also, in the chat section, you'll be able to find a link which will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website, where you'll be able to purchase a copy of An Ugly Truth. We, of course, highly encourage you to do so, and thank you for your patronage as that continues to help us bring you these live events. Drawing on their unrivaled sources, Sheera Frenkel and Cecilia Kang take readers inside the complex court politics, alliances, and rivalries within the company to shine a light on the fatal cracks in the architecture of the tech behemoth, Facebook. Their explosive, exclusive reporting led them to a shocking conclusion. The missteps of the last 5 years were not an anomaly, but an inevitability. This is how Facebook was built to perform. In a period of great upheaval, growth has remained the one constant under the leadership of Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. Both have been held up as archetypes of uniquely 21st century executives. He, the tech boy genius turned billionaire. She, the ultimate woman in business, an inspiration to millions through her books and speeches, but sealed off in tight circles of advisors and hobbled by their own ambition and hubris. Each has stood by as their technology is co-opted by hate mongers, criminals, and corrupt political regimes across the globe with devastating consequences. In An Ugly Truth, they are at least held accountable. Sheera Frenkel covers cybersecurity from San Francisco for the New York Times. Previously, she spent over a decade in the Middle East as a foreign correspondent, reporting for BuzzFeed, NPR, the Times of London, and McClatchy newspapers. Cecilia Kang covers technology and regulatory policy for the New York Times. Before joining the paper in 2015, she reported on technology and business for the Washington Post for 10 years. Frenkel and Kang were part of the team of investigative journalists recognized as 2019 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. The team also won the George Polk Award for National Reporting and the Gerald Loeb Award for Investigative Reporting. Ms. Frenkel and Ms. Kang will be in conversation today with Lulu Garcia-Navarro, the host of Weekend Edition Sunday and one of the hosts of NPR's morning news podcast, Up First. She is infamous in the IT department of NPR for losing laptops to bullets, hurricanes, and bomb blasts. For her work covering the Arab Spring, Garcia-Navarro was awarded a 2011 George Foster Peabody Award, a Lowell Thomas Award from the Overseas Press Club, an Edward R. Murrow Award from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Alliance for Women and the Media's Gracie Award for Outstanding Individual Achievement. She contributed to NPR News reporting on Iraq, which was recognized with the 2005 Peabody Award and the 2007 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Silver Baton. She has also won awards for her work on migration in Mexico and the Amazon in Brazil. Without any further ado, Lulu, the floor.
Thank you so much. And I promise we will keep these laptops on. I first want to say that this is very exciting to me because I know Sheera for a long time. We met in the Middle East. And so seeing this book come to fruition is wonderful. And I am, of course, a huge fan of Cecilia Kang. So thank you both for joining me in conversation. I would like to tell the people here, please put your questions. I'll get to them as we're talking. But I want to start actually a little bit with some statistics. Facebook. 2.8 billion monthly active users, 60% of active social media users it reaches, making it by far the most popular social media platform. Facebook, love it or loathe it, is integral to our lives. But how did that happen? Sheera and Cecilia's book really gets us inside the rooms where these discussions were taking place. And I want to start there with the hook that hooks us all, which is the news feed. Tell me how Mark Zuckerberg figured out that people wanted to see other people's lives.
You know, Mark Zuckerberg, when he was still in sort of the incubation period of Facebook, knew that he wanted to create something that was like MTV. there was this idea that you could spend hours kind of mindlessly scrolling through something. But unlike MTV, Facebook was getting data about people in real time. So the longer he kept you hooked, the longer he kept you using his product, the more information he got about you, the user. And it was really early on in the first sort of year of Facebook's launch that he came up with this idea of a newsfeed. And if anything was Mark Zuckerberg's invention, the newsfeed is really it. I mean, social media had been around here and there before Facebook. There was, people might remember MySpace, perhaps.
Maybe.
Right. The older ones among us might remember MySpace. But the idea of a newsfeed, of a constant scrolling loop of information of people around you, was completely novel. And you know, at the time that he was launching it, he was thinking, I can keep people engaged. I can keep people looking at this if I feed them information about people they're interested in constantly. But what's interesting is in that moment, he never thought of himself as launching a media company. He didn't make that jump between, oh, it was a neutral platform where people chose where to go. And now I'm giving people information, I'm showing them specific things. And even though that change was integral to the company and making Facebook successful, he has tried since then to maintain this position that they're still a neutral platform.
Right, that they're a platform and not a company. Cecilia, after he did that, he then monetized that information, because that's the key, right? You can invent the most successful thing in the world, but unless you're making money at it, it's not going to be around for very long. How does Facebook make money on what we post?
Yeah, you know, so Facebook understood that money could be made from selling ads based on the users and information about the users, the data that users give to Facebook. That is everything from your profile information to actually everything that you post in all your networks. The amount of data that Facebook has is more than many even government agencies have. I think many government agencies would be envious about the amount of information. We're not talking about just your age, your address, and your gender, even your political affiliation. This is information that's so vast and so deep that Facebook could even predict based on who your friends are, where you visited because of your GPS location when you have the app on, and based on a history of correlative data, predict perhaps what you might be doing. Perhaps you might be pregnant. Perhaps you might be about to get married. And those are the kinds of things that they could take to advertisers. They could take to, say, Dave's Bridal Shop, to a Coca-Cola and company, and say, look, these are the people who you want to target. And so we're going to sell you the profile information on these people to very laser target them with an ad on Facebook.
What was so great about this book, and there's a lot of stuff that is fascinating to read, but this, of course, was the sort of domain of Sheryl Sandberg, who came in from Google. And reading this, what was all these little tidbits are there about how actually Google monetizes your information. If I type in, you give this example, if I type in cheap Hawaiian vacations, there's actually a bidding war that happens behind the scenes about who is going to spam me with stuff about, stuff to do in Hawaii. And so she had come from that background into Facebook, which was just at the cusp of really becoming this behemoth that we know now. Tell me about that relationship, what she came to offer the company, and the relationship between these two people.
Yeah, I can take that too. So Sheryl Sandberg offered Mark exactly what he needed when he wanted to begin to monetize, as you said, Lulu. For the longest time, actually up until for the first 4 years of the company, Mark Zuckerberg didn't really care about making money. I mean, he famously, we have in the book, he was telling Don Graham, look, I don't really want to make revenue. I don't think about it. And actually in the early
head of the
days,
Washington Post back then.
The head of the Washington Post, right? The chairman of the Washington Post. And in a scene there, it's interesting, he told Don Graham like how Facebook works. And Don Graham said to him, also a Harvard alum, said, oh gosh, Mark, you're going to put the Crimson out of business with this Facebook project you have at Harvard, because every pizza joint's going to want to advertise on Facebook and not on the
He
Crimson.
Understood the threat.
He understood the threat. This is Donald Graham, the chairman of the Washington Post company, which relies on ads, for this business. And so, but Mark said to him, he kind of laughed and said, no, I don't think about that. I care about growth, basically. I care about users. he knew very early on that he wanted to grow the business into something really, really big. So in walked Sheryl Sandberg. Sheryl Sandberg, who was a great success with Google and who had built this very new thing, which was one of the first behavioral advertising businesses. And she was very successful there. And she also saw in Mark the potential for something that was very new and really big that could be global, which was Facebook. And they both shared the same ambition. They brought different things for the company, and they looked at each other as with a lot of opportunity.
You know, one of the things I think about is Mark wanted data. Mark saw data as power. He understood very, very early on that whoever had data on people was inherently powerful, but he wasn't thinking about money. He wasn't necessarily thinking of becoming as wealthy as we now know he is. And it was Sandberg that brought in that element. She's the one that looked at him and said that data is not just power, it is also money.
I mean, I want to ask you, Sheera, because that data that you're talking about, you both report that data privacy was a problem from the inception of this. Lots of concerns were raised very early on in the Facebook experiment, which is really what it was, by advocates and users. Facebook said all along that it doesn't sell our data, but is that true?
It's true on a technicality. It doesn't sell our data, it sells ads based on the data. So, Mark Zuckerberg, who famously said that to a senator when he's asked how Facebook makes money, he says, well, we sell ads, he's skirting the truth a little bit, right? Because ultimately the reason those advertisements are so effective and the reason why so many advertisers go to Facebook primarily is the data. I think that, Mark and Sheryl are very, very good at understanding what makes them better than any other company in terms of just, bringing in advertisers and bringing in revenue. And it's this comprehensive sort of 360-degree view they've formed on people. We have to remember it's Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, and a family of other apps that they control. So it's not just one product that they're analyzing you on, it's their family of products.
And what does that mean in practice, Cecilia? I mean, when we've said this stuff about what Facebook knows about you, I mean, when you have a company that knows so much about you, do we know how they secure our information?
Well,
or not?
We do have a lot of examples of how they have not secured our information. They have not been good about securing data from third parties, for example, and that was, this is a practice that was discovered with what's known as Cambridge Analytica. That is a company that was based in the UK, a political consulting firm that was discovered through news reports to have reams of Facebook data on tens of millions of Facebook users. And the way they got that was based on a policy way back in 2010, where Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg decided that what Facebook needed to do to grow was to get a bunch of apps to also attach to Facebook. And he was willing to share data, user data, with these apps so that those apps would stay on the platform. And then that way, users would stay more engaged because they could play Farmville and they can play games, they can play Words with Friends on the app, on Facebook, and keep things within the universe of Facebook. This is all, again, aimed towards the key goal of engagement, keeping the people there longer and coming back more frequently. So what we discovered with Cambridge Analytica, and I'll go back to that, is that what Facebook did was not secure the data. It gave data to third parties, which allowed an academic to get hold of all this data. That academic then gave it to Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica used this information to politically target, persuade voters. Their famous client was President Trump. The important lesson from there is that users are completely oblivious to what was happening to their data. It had passed at least two hands without them knowing. So that's, I think, one of the most stark examples of how they do not actually have a history of safeguarding data.
Well, I want to dig into the 2016 election, and of which obviously the saga of Cambridge Analytica is a part. But I actually want to ask you both about the algorithm, because this is this thing that controls so much of our social media experience across all these different platforms, but specifically on Facebook. And what you see in this book is that the algorithm is constantly being tweaked, and there's very little disclosure as to what it's doing or why. Can you talk to me about the power of that?
Yeah, the algorithm is in some ways Facebook's secret sauce. And they occasionally give us these tiny little windows into it, but they're always nebulous. For instance, when Mark Zuckerberg announced ahead of the 2016 elections that he was going to upvote, uprank family and friends, he said, people really want to see content from family and friends above that of others. People, he approached it with this, very soft and warm and fuzzy, like family and friends, isn't that nice? But what it really meant was that you were not seeing as much content from verified news sites. You were not seeing as much content from NPR, Washington Post, New York Times. Instead, you were seeing what your uncle and aunt thought was maybe a valid news source or a blog or some, random thing they just read on the internet. And you see these kinds of tweaks that Facebook thinks is going to have one effect, having very, very different effects. They also, one key thing about the algorithm that we know hasn't changed is that they emphasize emotive content. And by that, it's things that make you happy, things that make you sad, things that make you laugh, things that make you outraged. If they inspire emotion, you interact with it. And their AI is reading all that interaction as interest. So even if they feed you something that makes you really angry all day long, they've kept you online all day long. And that's a win as far as their bottom line is concerned.
Let's then now talk about politics, because that's really, why Facebook has literally had daily stories written about it, because of course, the data privacy stuff was important, but ultimately that's to do with advertising, which might seem less insidious to most people. But what you're talking about now is that all of a sudden, Facebook is being used in a different way. Zuckerberg wanted to get into the news business. And he has this news feed, and all of a sudden employees are saying, hey, misinformation is shooting to the top of what is being shared. And they complained. But what happened?
Well, right after the election, when the shock of the world, Donald Trump won, there was Mark Zuckerberg was hearing very public concerns about the surge of fake news on Facebook. And he even famously said in a conference right after the election that he displayed his surprise to hear about this. He said, I think it's a crazy idea that fake news could have affected the election. This is an example of, because you're right, Lulu, he was warned. They were warned. There were a lot of examples of false and misleading content that was surfacing because of the algorithm feeds. There were decisions that were made to not change the algorithm and not to clamp down on fake news. One particular person in the Washington office, the head of the office, said, look, like even my mother-in-law read some of these reports and they believe them to be true. There was a concern that if they were to clamp down on these fake news stories, many of them that happened to be very partisan, that it would look like Facebook was taking a political position, that it was siding with one candidate over another. The 2016 election, and because it was so divisive and it was such a rancorous sort of time, it was a time that really brought politics into so many policy decisions there. And to the reaction on fake news, they did know, and this is one of many examples that we show in the book where executives were warned early. Executives did not heed those warnings, and trouble inevitably surfaced.
Let's talk about Russian interference. You dedicate a lot of the book to what Facebook knew and when they knew it.
It's one of my favorite topics. I laugh when I say that because, my earliest reporting on Facebook was about Russian election interference in 2016. I started to look into it, and at the time I was new to reporting on Facebook, but I kept thinking, something odd is happening here. We know that there are Russian actors that have interfered in elections across Eastern Europe. And is anyone thinking about this happening here in the United States? And so I've been personally following this story for 5 years. I think what we really document in this book in a way that hasn't been documented before was Facebook's own security team. And, this is in the beginning of 2016, in the sort of late winter of 2016, starts to find the Russians, poking around the platform, looking around people tied to the elections. By the summertime, they already see them feeding those emails from the Clinton campaign to journalists. I think for me, one of the most startling scenes is a Facebook engineer is sitting there watching a Russian hacker try to convince a US journalist not just to take an email that's been hacked from the Clinton campaign, but he's framing a story for him. As a journalist, that's just, maybe because I'm a journalist, it's such an appalling moment, the idea that this Russian hacker is saying, oh, make sure you drop it right before she goes on stage, at her next rally, so it has maximum impact. And here's a suggested headline to make sure people look at it. And this Facebook engineer is watching it and he's outraged. I mean, he's like, what am I watching? This is someone who came from government intelligence, who has never seen anything like this happen before. And even then at that stage, Facebook, they go to US law enforcement, they go to the FBI, but they don't go public with what they've seen.
Mm. And do we know why?
Yeah, well, I think, well, go ahead, take a second. I can do it as well.
There's a lot of debate within the
Yeah.
team, right? I mean, I think that there was the part of the team that was saying, we have to go public. Americans have to know what we're seeing. Americans have to know how bad this is. And then there was another part of the security team, at least, that was saying, well, it's not our role. We're not a government agency. Our role is to give this to the FBI. We should give it, to the Obama administration, which is still in charge at this point, and let them figure it out. And a lot of them assumed the Obama administration was going to come out with something. They thought that ahead of the election, Obama himself would get up and say something about what they already knew. And I think they were shocked that that didn't happen. Facebook executives, on the other hand, when they learned about what the security team were finding, were frankly a little bit upset because they felt like it put them in a bad position. Like, oh, well, shit, if we didn't know about this, we wouldn't have to disclose it. But now that you've told us, we have to make a, decision about it.
I would add that it just wasn't a priority for the top executives. Their minds were focused on the business and new technologies and expanding Facebook. And that's a consistent point of tension throughout the book, where we show that growth is always rubbing up against protecting users. And the top executives will today say, look, we were looking for the right things. We were looking, but we weren't looking for the right things. But we kept hearing over and over from our many, many sources that helped us write this book, that told us their stories, is that they tried so hard. And in fact, there's a culture at Facebook where the top executives are surrounded by people who often don't let bad news or tough news or challenging news information surface and penetrate and reach the inner circle.
I mean, let's just say this is Sheryl Sandberg herself. The name of her conference room is Only Good News.
Let me ask you this. We've got a question from the audience, and I think it's a good one. I will ask you to put it into the Q&A instead of the chat, and please keep them coming. But Christopher asks, how do you think the principal's personal politics affected how they manage their internal policies and the company generally?
I think there's perhaps a misperception that Joel Kaplan, who is one of the central figures in our book, as well as Mark Zuckerberg, are ideologues and that they're Republicans. Joel Kaplan is a Republican. Mark Zuckerberg is actually very, he very explicitly does not say what political party he affiliates with. But Joel Kaplan is the head of global public policy and is a Republican. I think that it's good business in Joel Kaplan's mind and in Mark Zuckerberg's mind to be politically neutral. So that means whoever is in power is the party that you serve, and the party that you try to influence, and the party that you try to become close to. And over the last 5 years, that was President Trump, and that was a Republican majority in Congress. It's changed now. But at that time, what we saw also, because there was so much fear that Trump continued to cross new lines and that he was testing Facebook's policies on speech, like with hate speech, misinformation, that the company was just so afraid they didn't know how to handle an individual like him, even though there are political figures all over the world that actually know how to use Facebook and use Facebook in the same way that President Trump, the former president, did.
I mean, Cecilia and I often wondered about Zuckerberg's political leanings. I think, everyone we've talked to that's close to him says it's just not something he talks about. I mean, unlike Sandberg, who is very open about her support for the Democratic Party, obviously openly endorsing Hillary Clinton in 2016, Mark doesn't have much of a political affiliation. He is in the business of Facebook. Whatever is good for Facebook is good for him. And he seems to genuinely be sort of, I was going to say neutral, but it's a bit sort of apathetic when it comes to political parties.
I mean, I want to now talk about Trump because one of the things that I have found inexplicable, truly inexplicable, is how Facebook embedded people within the Trump campaign. They offered it to the Clinton campaign. They tried to be equal opportunity. But the very idea that is something that they thought would be useful or good for them, why did they want to get into the business of politics? That's what that is there.
Yeah.
They experimented with it before, right? The US elections are not the only ones in which they have, cozied up really to a person running for office. This is something they've done in the Philippines, something they've done in India. Being close to whoever wins an election is good business for Facebook, right? And it's even better for them if they can embed with every candidate that's running, because then they have 100% chance of being close to the next prime minister or president of that country. So I think, Facebook probably genuinely saw this as a way to get closer to the future president of the United States. And I think, from our conversations, they were quite surprised that Hillary Clinton didn't take them up on it in the same way that Trump did. But it's interesting that at no point did they say, oh, is it wrong of us to only help one of these politicians? Is it wrong that we're only sitting in the offices of one campaign? Even if Clinton turned them down, maybe there should have been a point where they said, well, we shouldn't really be doing this with one campaign and not the other.
I would also add that it's good business, not in the direct revenue sense. It's not like they make a ton of money off of political ads across the board.
They make that point a lot.
Yeah, they make much more money off of commercial ads, right? But it's because the former president and other political leaders make Facebook the center of conversation. And that's what they want. Facebook needs to be the center of conversation, and for people to constantly engage, either to push back on ideas, to support ideas, to share. And they knew that Trump was absolutely one of these sort of super users that had a huge following, nearly 30 million followers by the time he left, but also that being a center of conversation would have a sort of a halo effect across the site, because people would constantly share his things and his postings.
Yeah, I mean, he generated that engagement, right? You have this scene in the book where all of a sudden, Zuckerberg is asked, didn't you notice that there was just an overwhelming amount of content about and for Trump? And he tried to deflect, Facebook's culpability in that. We have another question, which I want to ask. Actually, before I ask this, I want to ask you this, which is this. I have so many questions, but this is the other one. Before we go back to Trump, which is, how hard was it to get into this very secretive company and find the things that you found? Because, I mean, it has been very hard. It's a very opaque place. And so, you have hundreds of sources. How hard was it to sort of get the picture that you paint?
Lulu, you know this because you reported on dictatorships in the Middle East and how hard it is when you approach a dictatorship, and how it's a little bit like, it's a little bit like you start off small, right? You start off with one source, and then two, and then three. You write out articles, and then slowly, when people see that you're trying to do good reporting on the company, they come to you. And so, Facebook at times has kind of assumed that everyone we spoke to was some disgruntled outsider, ex-employee that got fired. We spoke to more than 400 people. The majority of them still work there. They're not talking to us because there's some disgruntled employee that got fired. They're talking to us because they care about Facebook, and they feel like the company has made serious mistakes and not learned any lessons from them. And they wanted to finally sort of get a version of the truth out there that wasn't sanitized by Facebook's PR department, which is, unfortunately, Facebook is incredibly controlling of its messaging. And interestingly, when we were reporting this book, Facebook knew we were writing. They often told their own employees, don't talk to Sheera, don't answer her calls, don't answer her messages. And I had at least 6 or 7 sources, people I had never spoken to before or met, call me up and say, they're not going to tell me who to talk to. They're not going to tell me, I'm not going to be controlled. And I was like, the more Facebook tried to control them and control the messaging, the angrier some of these people got and reached out to us on their own. So thank you, Facebook, for trying to be so controlling of our book project, because it ultimately did help a little bit.
Yeah.
Anne Marimo writes, how has your coverage of Facebook and research for your book affected how you engage with social media, the information that you share and consume?
Hi, Anne. I know Anne Marimo. Great to hear you that you're on this call. We both use Facebook. We're both on Facebook. We both are on Instagram and WhatsApp. Obviously, we have to as reporting tools and to understand the technology that we're writing about. We're both early Facebook users as well. I definitely think a lot more about every single thing I do when I'm on Facebook, and I think about the repercussions. I think about the machinery behind the scenes and what every single post means and how it feeds into this engine. We're both prolific Twitter users. I like TikTok. I watch TikTok. So does Sheera. We were watching a YouTube video in a car today. We are media and technology reporters, so we obviously use these tools. But I think we were surprised at how much we learned. We actually thought we knew everything that there was to know about Facebook before we started this project. And this sounds like ridiculous actually now thinking about it. We thought, oh, this is going to be an easy book. We have so much material.
We'll get ready in 6 months.
In 6 months, we have so much material on the cutting room floor from all of our other stories. It's going to be so easy. It's been surprising to us how much we did not know and how our assumptions were sort of wrong, and how we needed to educate ourselves as well. And I'll speak for myself a little bit more about my own participation in this and importantly, how the business works and how the technology works. And we really hope that readers will take that away from them, not just a general sort of maybe ambient knowledge of what Facebook is and how it works, but a real deep understanding of what motivates the company, what drives this $85 billion company.
Yeah, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. I use it for reporting, but also I use it to connect with friends, because social media is the point of this book is not that social media is bad. Social media can be a wonderful tool for connecting with friends, for sharing interesting things, for learning new information. The point of this book is to understand the business model behind it, to be wise about what it's collecting about you, the data it's showing you. Maybe when you see that thing at the top of your newsfeed that seems too good to be true or too crazy to be true, just think, oh, wait, this is here because it's very emotive. It's meant to get me angry or sad or whatever. And I'm going to wait a moment before I share it. Maybe I'll double check the source. I'll verify that the information is right. I'll make sure it's not misconstruing something. Because the moment you hit that share button, you're just amplifying it, right? You're going to amplify it to your friends and maybe get them outraged about something. And so, we started thinking about it a little bit like sugar, right? We're not ever getting rid of sugar, right? We just know that sugar in large quantities isn't good for us. We know it doesn't necessarily do great things for our body. We just want a little bit of sugar in our lives because it's pleasant and nice. But we know what its outcome is, and that's what we think about social media. Social media is going to be here for not just our lives, but for our children's lives.
We've got another question from Nina Warner. Is there any significant fall off from Facebook users as a result of Facebook's careless position on allowing fake news? Or conversely, is there a downside with Trump being taken off the conservative for the conservative MAGA types who participate on Facebook?
I can answer the first one, maybe. I mean, we see it every day still. We see the fallout from fake news. Facebook has hired tens of thousands of content moderators. They've dramatically expanded their security team. So they're putting a new eye that's supposed to detect false and harmful information, hate speech, other things that violate their policies. But even just the other day, the White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, was saying on a podcast that when the White House asks Americans, why aren't they getting vaccinated? The response is always really false stories that they had heard about the potential side effects of vaccines. And then the White House follows up with these Americans and asks, where did you hear that information? And Ron Klain said the number one place is Facebook. This is happening every single day still. And
we'll also say, especially among immigrant groups and Latinos, WhatsApp, the other Facebook property.
Yes. And I wrote a story about this, and it's not in our book, but it's an article in the New York Times. I mean, it is, for many immigrant groups in the United States, including Latinos, but also, Filipino immigrant groups, various, Chinese, they were sharing, misinformation on WhatsApp in amazing numbers. And that's something Facebook's not monitoring. That's something none of us have any data on. Other than the physicians, I would say the doctors who have people coming into their offices and saying, I'm not going to get a vaccine because of this, and then holding up their phones and showing that message on WhatsApp, or that article that was shared on WhatsApp.
I mean, you do touch on the COVID misinformation for sure, and that is the current iteration of what everyone is discussing. But I do want to go back and talk about specifically January 6th, and then the decision to deplatform former President Trump, which, had to have been a monumental decision. So detail a little bit about the role that Facebook played in January 6th, and then also how the decision was made to kind of take this megaphone away from the former president, who'd been so instrumental, to Facebook's popularity.
Yeah, it's like watching a slow motion accident happen, really. I mean, the day after the November vote happens, Facebook sees the first Stop the Steal groups forming on the platform. And these are groups that are started by known sort of conservative activists, people within the Tea Party movement, and then, Women for Trump. And they managed to go hugely viral. I mean, they're adding thousands of new Facebook members every minute. The viral growth was so big that Facebook's own engineers were like shocked and basically running to one another. Are you seeing these groups? These are groups that are dedicated to spreading the false idea that Trump stole the elections and that there was widespread voter fraud. They were sharing video after video and article after article, making all sorts of false claims about the elections, such as that dead people voted or people's dogs and cats voted in the election. And they're getting people outraged, right? And we've talked about this already. What is outrage good for? Oh, outrage is great for Facebook's algorithms. And so they were driving this anger over month after month after month. Facebook takes down some of the groups, but not others. And they allow this momentum to build until on the eve of January 6th, you have a group, which myself and other reporters shared with Facebook, posting photos of assault rifles that they're bringing with them to Washington, and writing in captions things like, oh, where are you going to pack your gun? And how are you going to carry that weapon from this state to that state? It was very spelled out on Facebook that something bad was getting ready to happen on January 6th. And that the groups were still being found even as people were physically traveling to the Capitol.
And then the decision to ban Trump. I think arguably Facebook's hand was forced when Twitter banned Trump first. There's always been this sort of, catching up with what Twitter does. I think throughout 2020, actually, Twitter starts to label the former president's tweets as false or misleading or harmful, and then Facebook's follow suit. Then Facebook, after the Capitol insurrection, Twitter decides to ban the former president permanently. Facebook comes out with some sort of like middle of the road decision. They say, we are going to ban the president temporarily and indefinitely, which was confusing to us. Like, what does that actually mean?
What does that mean?
What does that mean? And what we're going to do is we shouldn't have the responsibility, and this is a reoccurring theme in our book. We shouldn't have the responsibility, Facebook's executives always said, we don't want to have the responsibility of making such important decisions. So we are forming an outside third-party body known as the Facebook Oversight Board, also commonly known as the Supreme Court of Content Decisions on Facebook, to finally decide on Trump. So permanently, so indefinitely and temporarily, we're banning Trump, but we're going to kick this decision to the Facebook Oversight Board. The Facebook Oversight Board very cleverly says no. Later, a few weeks later, sends it back to Facebook and says, look, you do not have policies in place to address political figures and violations like Trump's violation of the integrity of election and incitement of violence. You have to be clearer on this. And that's a really important reoccurring theme. I mean, we're writing about a scene in January 2021, but throughout the book, you'll see over and over this theme of the company not having in place policies and safeguards for its users. It truly feels like the plane is in flight and they're putting together the landing gear with the plane still in flight.
Is that because of the way that Facebook itself was sort of brought to life? I mean, again, reading the way that you describe it in this book, it's a place where, engineers are given a lot of autonomy, where, it's about like, let's throw things against the wall and see what sticks, to try and, promote this experimental and creative DNA. I mean, that's what arguably maybe makes the company work. So this idea of not having policies in place, I mean, is that something that perhaps is deliberate?
It's interesting. As reporters, we went into it hoping that there was going to be some method, some thinking. We thought, maybe we'll uncover that they had all these meetings and really sort of sophisticated thinking going into this. And, again and again, we were really surprised to discover that they were just making ad hoc decisions. And that it was a group of people in a room for a day, sometimes 2 days if they delayed making a decision on something, tossing around some arguments and then coming to a call. And then, especially in the case of Trump, right? One of the things we lay out is how they make a quick decision on President Trump in 2015 to allow him to post something about, he says he wants to ban Muslims from America. And their own employees say, we think this is hate speech. Why are we allowing it? We would remove it if someone else said it, but why are we keeping it if Trump says it? And they make this decision to do a carve out for Trump. Like, he's really important. You should hear what he has to say. He's running for president. Let's keep it. And then that decision leads to another decision, leads to another decision where, 4 years later, he's the president and he's saying looting and shooting. And he's saying that you can cure COVID with disinfectants and UV light and things that they've explicitly said they're going to stop from spreading on the platform and ban people for. He's allowed to say because years earlier, they made this decision that they're now sticking by.
That's really interesting. I'm going to take a few of these questions here. First of all, from Andrew Schwartzman, there is some speculation that if a breakup order becomes likely, that Facebook would spin off Instagram and especially WhatsApp on its own. Some analysts think that those spin-offs would actually create more value than the integrated company. Do you share those views? Do you have thoughts on that?
It's so just to inform the viewers a little bit about what's going on. So there was a lawsuit that was thrown out by a court recently, and it was the Federal Trade Commission's lawsuit and that of more than 40 state attorneys general to try to break up Facebook. The court threw out aspects of the Federal Trade Commission's lawsuit and threw out entirely the state's lawsuits. So that was a big step back for government regulation and oversight of Facebook. It was a huge victory for Facebook itself. So the question about what would happen if there was a breakup and there were 3 separate companies, what you're not addressing there still, though, is that these 3 independent companies would still have the business model that is the Facebook business model. It is built on data. It's built on selling ads. You're not seeing it right now as much on WhatsApp, but that's where it's headed. You're seeing the merging of these apps right now because the foundation being the business machinery underneath. So the real question is, are you creating 3 huge advertising behemoths, or are you actually addressing some of the core problems, which we believe in our reporting, and after story and anecdote after anecdote in the book, we show that 2 really important key things have been core to the Facebook story, which is this real prioritization of growth and a business model that needs users to constantly engage and give more of their data so that can be sold to advertisers.
Well, just one quick thing I'd add is that in this lag of time, while we all wait for something to happen and see what the government's going to hand down, Facebook is making it harder and harder for them to be separated. People may have noticed a couple of weeks ago that your messaging apps were merged. If you're a Facebook user, you probably saw that Instagram, WhatsApp, they're all beginning to merge together. Facebook says it's to make it easier for people. So if someone is your friend on Instagram, they can message you across all 3 places. But once you start merging those, how, just from a purely technical point of view, are government regulators going to force you to then unmerge that? It's much easier to bring things together, as we all know, than to try and then tear them apart. And I imagine Facebook has more like this planned. It could take years for the government to make up its mind about what it's going to do. And in that time, Facebook has plenty of time to unite its different arms of the company even further.
Before I take another question, this is something that's particularly close to my heart, which is, of course, Facebook's relationship with the news business and what has the role that it has played in in basically the bottom lines of news organizations across the world. And so I'm wondering where you see that going, because we now, as you know, in the news business, know when the algorithm has been tweaked, because you can see it in traffic very, very quickly. At a certain point, 40%, 50%, sometimes 60% of traffic was coming from Facebook before things changed. And now that number is vastly decreased. But what do you think, and as you rightly point out, that means that less credible, researched, verified information is getting onto the platform. So where is that going? Where does that relationship stand?
I think one of the problems here is that we don't know, right? It's at the will of Mark Zuckerberg. Is news media at the will of Mark Zuckerberg? I mean, perhaps. We've seen them at various times try to court small newspapers, and I can't remember the name. What was that program they launched where they were going to invest in local newspapers?
The Facebook Journalism Project?
Right. It's a good program, but this is $1 trillion company that has decimated many local newspapers, and I've spoken to editors of small town papers that have called it too little too late. Facebook, just in the month of the US elections, Facebook made a decision, we have this in the book, to amplify real legitimate news organizations. They have a scale, which, by the way, they don't reveal to anyone. They don't tell news organizations where they fall on the scale, but they have a scale where they rank, more legitimate and versus legitimate news, ones that they see regularly sharing fake news versus those that don't. And they put their finger on this dial that they essentially have. And they say, it's the US elections. Let's make sure people are seeing legitimate news more. Let's amplify all the sources of information that we know, fact check, have, professional journalists, have editing standards. And let's put those higher on the newsfeed, because we really want people getting accurate information in the time of the vote. They then dial that back down. They then make a decision, a month after elections. Oh, well, the election's over. Let's dial that back down. And now people, and there's an argument to be made of freedom of thought, freedom of expression, share whatever you want. But there's also an argument to be made of Facebook's own algorithms are amplifying the things that are false, that are hyperbolic perhaps. And so, Facebook knows this, it can make this change, and it just decides not to.
Looking at what you lay out, which is, in many regards, quite a damning picture of a company that really has a lot of our information and has an enormous amount of power. What ends up happening, though, is that Facebook is really at odds with both major parties in this country. I mean, if there's some bipartisan support over anything in this country, it is, problems with social media companies in general, and Facebook in particular. I mean, how does that work for them then?
Yeah, I mean, Facebook is it's in a really ironic position in that for all of the effort they put in to try to become closer to the Republican Party when they were in charge, that's ultimately not paid off. The former president recently sued Facebook as well as other social media companies. I think that there's one person that's quoted in our book who's talked about how making decisions based on politics and what political calculus could be good for the business. And let's be clear, I'm going to unpack that a little bit. The politics are important to Facebook and their decisions because they don't want regulation that could actually harm their business model and their trajectory for growth. So they want to keep people happy, those who are in power. So once you make these political decisions, you're playing in a game where you are potentially never going to win, because one party is going to be upset with what you do. There's going to be suspicions. I think in Facebook's case, it was a real coming together of many things that made Facebook the target of both Republican and the Democratic Party. Democratic Party was incredibly upset with Facebook's role in the 2016 election, with allowing for election interference to occur on their site and the surge of fake news. Republicans have a feeling that Facebook and other big tech companies are biased against conservatives, that there is a liberal bent within the company that means that they will censor figures who are of the right, and they will suppress information through their algorithms, which is a black box. I think Facebook has invited so much speculation from both sides and so much anger. Right now, they're in like this incredibly ironic position for a company that's cared so much about not upsetting either party. They've landed right where they don't want to be, which is they've absolutely been the center of ire of both parties. I mean, there are very few things right now that unite Republicans, Democrats in Washington right now, and on legislation, and is reining in Facebook and reining in big tech.
Mm. So what next then?
Well, what next then for the company is,
Yes.
it is an incredibly successful company. It has a $1 trillion valuation.
This
The
is the
business
thing. Throughout all of this, they've just keep printing money and growing and growing. And is that because there are essentially a monopoly? No one else does quite what they do. They bought up smaller companies that could challenge them, and essentially, like I said at the beginning of this, love it or hate it, Facebook is somehow going to be a part of your life.
I mean, the government stood by for years and watched Facebook acquire all those companies and didn't take action. And now they're playing catch up, right? And they're playing catch up on laws that were created so long ago, the steel industry and oil, and they don't know how to take those laws and apply them to a modern day company like Facebook. It's something that I think that legislators are struggling to do. And so what next? Well, I mean, Facebook continues to grow massively. They have resources that few other companies have to make sure that they always try and stay, a little bit ahead of the curve. And even though they have competitors now, companies like TikTok have really, emerged in recent years to take on Facebook, and there are other companies close on their heels. New companies have the reach, the three family of apps. I think Cecilia mentioned this earlier, over 3 billion users across the world. I mean, companies are going to struggle to catch up with that. I think, what happens next, really, I think when Cecilia and I were talking about this book, and in 10 years, do we write a sequel, is what happens to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg? Mark is Facebook, Facebook is Mark. Does he stay there for the rest of his life, or does he do what Bill Gates does and leave for his own philanthropic foundation? Sheryl Sandberg has openly talked about leaving over the last 5-6 years. There were, we documented in the book, people talked about her leaving for the Clinton campaign to become treasurer. She's not hidden the fact that Facebook isn't her life in the same way that it's Mark's life. And if one of those two finally leaves, do we then start to see change within Facebook? Do we then finally start to see new personalities at the helm, new executives at the helm who are going to do things differently?
Oh, Cecilia,
I would also that, I mean, we found Mark and Sheryl to be so fascinating as a business partnership. Two very well-known leaders who are also incredibly enigmatic, truly. They are very controlling of their images. And so we really wanted to pull the curtain and understand who they are. What we've seen really importantly is the evolution of their relationship. And it does matter who leaves and who stays, but particularly Mark Zuckerberg. This company is structured in such a unique way where he has the majority of all voting stock. And what that means is that he has the last word on all decisions. We take you inside the room on some of these decisions that are solely Mark decisions, and people are kind of trying to tell him that's not a good idea. And can you tell somebody else, and can you get somebody else to email Mark, because I've already bugged him too much, and people are afraid to challenge him on these decisions. So he's making these on-the-fly decisions on what do I do with this viral video that's been doctored of the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, where she appears drunk. Massive debate internally. Sheryl Sandberg herself thinks, no, I don't think that it should stay up. We should take it down. Ultimately, Mark Zuckerberg decides, after a lot of just on-the-fly discussion internally, that the video should stay up. And that shows actually his control. In many ways, this is the Mark Zuckerberg production that he described when he first started the company in 2004.
Fascinating. A few comments. Michael Keegan says, when can I pre-order the sequel? Which I think is good news for you both. Some of these have sort of been answered, but I am curious about this. Do Facebook employees have any consequences if they openly criticize management to the media? You hear about some employees describing the loose oversight positioning of Facebook. What is the internal culture like?
It's Interesting. Facebook internally likes to describe itself as so transparent. I mean, every single week, and we do describe quite a few of these meetings in the book, they have something called an Ask Me Anything, an all hands meeting, where anybody in the company can ask Mark and Sheryl a question, and they take that as a marker of how transparent. Look how open we are with everybody, that even the most lowly of Facebook employees can ask Mark Zuckerberg a question at our weekly meetings. What I would note, however, is that there's very little tolerance for dissent and disagreement, as we've seen. You know, in these meetings that they have, when people do raise difficult questions, they're often glossed over. They're given like very slick PR answers. And employees have, especially in recent years, really bristled at that. And it's been frustrating for them. In terms of employees openly criticizing Facebook to the media, it doesn't happen because you would get fired. If you spoke to a journalist with your own name, you would be violating your non-disclosure agreement with Facebook, and you would be within minutes called into the offices of HR and told to pack your bags and go home. They do not tolerate employees speaking to the media without, not just approval, but a PR person either physically sitting in the room or being on the telephone with you. That's one of the reasons why it's very hard as a reporter, to report on Facebook, and why Cecilia and I really, spent years accumulating these sources that were willing to meet with us outside of, Facebook's PR shop and give us an unvarnished, version of what they were seeing.
My last question is this. I saw that Mark Zuckerberg wrote an internal memo about this book, saying that it was going to be getting a lot of attention, but that it was not going to be an accurate reflection of the Facebook that they all know and love. I guess my question to you is, there is a sense, and I've heard this a lot, specifically from people in Silicon Valley writ large, that the media is out to get social media. That there are two sides of a pie, and one is losing. And there's been this sort of idea that it's driven by acrimony. I know the answer to this, being a journalist, but it is a question that I'm often asked, and I would like to just hear your response to that, as to why you think it's so important to do this kind of deep dive into this company.
Right. I mean, my answer to that is easy. Facebook is more powerful than most governments and more wealthy than most countries. And much like a dictatorship, it does not give open access. There is no FOIA that I can file to find out what's happening in that company. I cannot walk into their offices and ask somebody anything I want to know. And so as a journalist, we think it's even more important, a company as powerful and as wealthy as Facebook, to dig deep and to figure out what's going on and why they're making the decisions they're making and why they're impacting democracy in the way that they are. This has nothing to do with, really, for us, the business of journalism. This has to do with what good journalism is. Good journalism is, bringing truth to power. Good journalism is holding the powerful to account, and Facebook is incredibly powerful.
Cecilia?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that. I mean, I just think that it's very convenient to say that it's jealousy motivates coverage. And I would also note that Facebook has a massive public relations apparatus. I mean, to extend Sheera's metaphor of governments, it's one, people who have talked to us, even within the company, would describe it as a propaganda, wing. It is to keep the image of Facebook as to deflect attention away from the things that are ugly truths, really. The business model, the constant need for engagement, profiting off users, but with collateral damage for its users. And I think that the best thing that we can do, the best public service we can do, is to shed a light on actually what the company is, to tilt the aperture a little bit, to make people understand the company is really truly is part of business, and it's a technology that is not going away, that will continue to be very powerful, and for people to understand what it means every time that they open that app.
I want to thank you both. It's a phenomenal book. Here it is.
Huh.
There you go. There it is. Everyone hold up a copy. Really, thank you so much for this conversation.
You're so great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
On behalf of Politics and Prose, I want to thank everyone here for joining us. I want to thank our guests for this very informative and insightful discussion. Of course, everyone to go buy a copy or two from politicsandprose.com. The link is in the chat. And for everyone out there, I want you to stay well and stay well read. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.